Welcome everybody. Thank you so much this morning for joining us on this webinar in the exciting new world of technology as opposed to face-to-face. I'm going to introduce our moderator to you and our panelists in just a moment, but just a few housekeeping rules. I hope everybody understands about the Q&A process, and please feel free to be sending questions and answers through to us. We're going to keep this fairly tight today, but it is such an important and topical question around what the heck is happening with our public transport system and what can we expect to see in the future. So if I can start by welcoming the fabulous Dr. Simon Barrett from L.E.K Australia, who's going to be our moderator today. Great to see you, Simon. Thank you very much for joining us. Excuse me. Rod Staples, Secretary of Transport for New South Wales, man with a very big job on his hands at the moment, but obviously first week in and things seem to be going very well. Emma Thomas, Partner of Infrastructure and Urban Renewal at PwC, and the fabulous Leah Waymark, who is of course the Chief Executive Officer at Metro Trains Australia. And Simon and Leah are both board members at TTF, and Leah also sits on our fiduciary board and does an outstanding job. Thank you so much everybody, one and all. And I'm now going to hand over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Margie. Good morning, everyone. We have three terrific panelists and about 45 minutes to spend with them. I'm going to ask each of you maybe to make an opening remark. It's been an extraordinary couple of months for everyone, but particularly for the public transport community. Maybe if you could just start by giving us a sense of, apart from the very obvious reduction in patronage, what have been the biggest impacts on the public transport systems that you're involved in? Maybe Leah, could I ask you to go first?
Yeah, sure, Simon. So I think for us, you know, the obvious thing is patronage, but it's all of the things that go with patronage. So where those of us that are private operators take some patronage risk in some of our contracts. So obviously that's had a really big impact. It's something that our contracts would never have foreseen to the extent that we've had. And so there's a range of things that of course come with that. I think also just, you know, it's our people and our customers. So, you know, the changes that we've had to make to help support them, to protect them, to work in different ways. So those are probably the immediate big things. And then of course, just looking at cleaning and other things that we're needing to do quite differently from what we do today.
Thanks, Leah. Rod?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Look, it's been an extraordinary time, no question at all. And I think for us, pretty similar to what Leah's saying, albeit from the government authority side, we've obviously got a number of operators that operate under us across the whole state. So really keeping engaged with the operators has been a really high priority in terms of just navigating all of this. The purpose we've got at the moment, Simon, is pretty profound. I think it's, for me, and I know the organisation, we feel pretty privileged to be able to help the community through this crisis. But things are shifting pretty aggressively for us now, so helping school kids get back to school, helping people get back into jobs is a big focus for us. The thing that I'd probably call out as the sort of new thing, I wouldn't say it's new, but really accelerated, is data and information. And when you're trying to do things like physical distancing, have really good handle on where cleaning's going on, how customers are behaving, where you need your staff to be. We're putting absolute pressure on our data and analytics and so forth in a way that we've never done before. And actually really excited about what we're learning and experimenting with in that space, because it's helping us to make decisions operationally on the run that we would have never thought of doing 2 months ago. So that would be my big sort of take for this group. There's a bit of an exciting opportunity amongst some anxious times.
Yeah, and I've seen some of that in the media earlier in the week. Emma, what are you seeing across your portfolio of clients?
Well, I think more than just the portfolio of clients, I think we should all be really proud of the response that the public transport agencies have made. I think their ability to maintain trust at the time with clients that really need them, their customers who really use them every day. I've seen our public transport agencies really putting a human face to their own people, making sure that their people are safe, but also promoting the activities that people are doing every day across all of the websites and the LinkedIn and social media channels. That's been a really nice change. There's been a bunch of new jobs being created across the board, and you can see the efforts made. I know we have to do a lot of extra cleaning now, so being able to really shift into promoting jobs for people who really need them at this time has been great to see. And then finally, this is just a minor thing, but I think one that will last for the longer term, the reduced use of cash in the system, I think is actually quite a big change to public transport, and one people probably don't necessarily know the impact that collecting cash creates on an operational system. But if we can shift to not having as much of it in the system, I think that'll be a long-term change. So that's a minor thing.
Yeah, and that's broader than just PT. Obviously, it's happening across retail. Leah, as part of an organisation that's Hong Kong based and has dealt with some of these earlier pandemics, I have some understanding that MTR, I think, has pushed the envelope quite far in terms of technology innovations that can be used in and around public safety on rail in a way that maybe other parts of the world haven't had to think about so far. What lessons have been learnt from some of those earlier outbreaks, and what are the types of things that people have installed in Hong Kong and elsewhere?
Yeah, sure. So there's definitely a lot of use, and Rod really touched on this as well. New South Wales, I think, within Australia is certainly leading the way in terms of the information. I mean, through all of this, we can provide information, we can put decals to guide people, but ultimately it's information that's going to help people make their own decisions and use their common sense as to how and when they travel on public transport. So in terms of the work that MTR's done, definitely we always tap into the work of all of our shareholders, and there's a lot happening there. I think it's going to take us a little while to catch up, but there's a lot of work being done. And certainly we're passing a lot of information on to customers in a way that we haven't before. So agree completely with Rod's point earlier that, I think that's one of the great things to come out of this. Of course, Hong Kong was sort of ahead of where Australia is in terms of the changes in public transport and the changes in the way it's being used. That said, it is a system that is used more extensively than any of ours are in Australia. So I think we've got a bit more work to do on that, but there's definitely a lot to learn, and we should borrow with pride.
Rod, it's been a pretty challenging week in New South Wales, particularly with the some social distancing guidance that maybe was at the stricter end of the spectrum in terms of what we've seen elsewhere. How do you feel the system has managed through the front half of this week? And I guess, what have you learned about the challenge of moving the many thousands of school kids, back to school this week, in terms of what that might mean for a sort of gentle return to the office for the rest of us over the coming months?
Yeah, look, it has been a challenging week, Simon, but I've been really sort of proud of the way the organisations as a whole have stood up, and the way our frontline staff have really been able to support the response. There's no doubt at all about that. The physical distancing, we definitely went on the conservative end. And combined with cleaning, most of our vehicles are getting cleaned 3 or 4 times a day at the moment. If you get out on our network, you'll just see it in an extraordinary way. Our real big objective here, Simon, is to think ahead over the next 3 to 6 months. What will the sentiment be about public transport? And what we want is a confidence in it. Now, that may be lower numbers to manage that confidence, but we want a sentiment that people think it's a safe place to travel. So going on the conservative end was a very deliberate decision to keep the space, keep the confidence. As the health things change, we can see some incremental shift on that potentially, where we might reduce the amount of physical distancing. In the short term, I'd say that across the board, if you aggregate the numbers, we're okay. We're sort of accommodating the sorts of demand we've got out there at the moment. Only about half of the school kids that would normally travel on public transport are travelling on public transport. They're either walking or getting lifts from their parents, depending on where they are. And we're actually equally focused on school zones and protecting kids getting dropped off in cars at the moment for the whole transport point of view. But there's limitations definitely on the capacity, Simon. So what can we do? That information is there, I think, for customers to choose the quiet times of the day to travel. That's one. The other levers we've got are to start to increase some frequency in services, which we're looking at in some areas where we've got some what I call overcrowding. It's a weird term to use when you've got a lot of space on your vehicle, but you call it overcrowding nonetheless. Continuing to provide some choices like cycling and walking. Next week we roll out a whole heap more cycleways, pop-up cycleways around Sydney for those inner city trips. So ideally those close into the city actually don't use public transport for a period of time. I think it's some time away before we have a mass return to offices, Simon, but I don't think transport alone is the only constraint. Every employer with an office tower occupation knows that they can't refill that office overnight because of all of the physical constraints and physical distancing required within an office. So I think there's actually a bit of a common purpose around safety in office as well as safety on transport that will probably work hand in hand over the next 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, you've got operations in a couple of different cities in Australia. Are there any differences you're seeing between particularly the rail operations in Sydney and Melbourne?
Yeah, there are some differences, but I think, you know, we work as part of networks in both of those states. So, you know, we come in and work with state, you know, transport departments to work with whatever's happening in that state. I think the biggest thing that we're noticing is New South Wales is definitely returning a bit faster than it is in Victoria, and part of that is people really following government guidelines and government, you know, direction around, you know, travelling, going back to the office, that kind of thing. So we're certainly seeing it being slower in Victoria, but you know, nothing too much other than that. I mean, we're undertaking quite a few customer surveys too. I think one of the other differences is, you know, people's choices around alternate ways to travel. And certainly in Victoria, the survey work and focus groups that we've done there are indicating that cycling people aren't seeing as an option for them. So yeah, that's probably one change, whereas I do believe there's a greater openness to that in New South Wales.
I'm also curious about the fact one of those 2 railways is, you know, is the only driverless, you know, automated metro in the country. Are there any distinctive advantages or disadvantages to that operation in such times?
Well, of course there are, in terms of you know the cleaning and you know another employee interface, I suppose there. But look, other than that, you know, I think the cleaning happens right across the trains. You know, our staff are undertaking the social physical distancing that is required, and we're supporting them with, you know, the tools, the PPE, etc., for them to undertake their work and feel confident. You know, I think Rod's point about restoring confidence, that's what it's all about across both networks. So it's there'll be differences in timing, I think, as to when people return into the sort of numbers that we're hoping for over the coming year. But that's about all.
I'll throw this one to the panel as a whole. Rod, you mentioned, you know, the sorts of things that you're doing to you know, to both rebuild confidence, but also give people other options. So, you know, traveling at different times of the day, more opportunity for active transport, obviously upping the cleaning regime quite significantly. Are there, you know, to anyone on the panel, what are the other sorts of tools and measures that people are considering, given that, you know, it looks like we may be in this sort of halfway land for some months, you know, possibly even years if a vaccine is a long way away. I'm curious to hear about the other types of things you're considering.
Yeah, Simon, I might just talk that in terms of the transport plan that we put out. Just public transport is definitely a lead. So while I look after New South Wales, I might just frame this question around Sydney. It's probably the sort of more congested, high demand area. We are still indicating to people that public transport is there, it's safe. As long as people adhere to physical distancing, they can be really comfortable that this is a great place to, a great system to use. But there's the active transport that I talked about, cycling and walking. Underneath that, trying to reintroduce a confidence in point-to-point rideshare and taxi travel. We've worked really closely with the industry around the cleaning regimes. We've actually stood up some cleaning centres for those vehicles to be able to go into to get cleaned really regularly across the day in various parts of the state. Trying to indicate if people aren't travelling on public transport or active to maybe use those for those short trips rather than having lots of cars going into car parks and so forth. We are saying that car is a choice. Now, that's a little bit counterintuitive for someone who's pretty advocacy about public transport, but we have to be pragmatic around that. Commercial car parks in the city are looking at some pricing regimes to encourage people to use those car parks. We've actually stood up a car park at Moore Park, which is a special event car park, made that available and free. Interestingly, no take up. There's a space of more than 1,500 cars, and we've had 6 or 10 on any given day. So the sense that the car will take over, actually, I'm not so sure that's actually going to be the case, because people will probably more likely retime we're actually engaged with employers in the city as well, pretty actively at various levels. And I think what we're trying to say is prioritise. We want kids in schools and we want to get people back into jobs. Now, back into jobs means retail, it means hospitality. Those people that must be in those workplaces, we want to get those back. So the employer industries, focus on those ones, allow the capacity to be used for those people that need to get into the job. For those that have got flexibility, we're not saying don't come into the office, but we're saying, you know, tier it, maybe one day a week for staff. You have different teams come in at different days and really flex it out. You may end up finding that's the way you want to work in the future anyway. So we do want a level of activity in the city, because there's no point having retail and hospitality if you haven't got a level of office worker in there as well. But that's the big flex. And, you know, ideally business adapts to that depending on their own office capacity and our transport capacity. I'm
with you on the emptiness of the CBD. I happened to find myself at Circular Quay at 8:30 on a Monday morning, and I was all on my own. It was a very unusual.
Yeah, so I probably should have said a bit earlier, it's really interesting to watch the profile at the moment. Our peak is 5:30 to 6:45 a.m. and it's fluorescent construction workers.
Yeah.
And then the afternoon peak is our worst because it coincides those workers going home with school kids going home. So our busiest time of the day at the moment is sort of 3 to 4:30. And yeah, extraordinary difference in sort of behaviour.
Quite different. Emma, you and I've talked about this ahead of this call about the sort of medium to longer term impacts on the transport network, and indeed even maybe as far as population patterns, you know, were this to be prolonged and impactful. What are some of your thoughts on that?
I think I think Leah had mentioned earlier the uncertainty of the times and the choices that people are making. And a lot of the planning work we provide for people is based on choices. And it's not very clear at the moment what those long-term choices might be. I think, you know, businesses, from some of the conversations I've had as early as this morning, are thinking that they might have between 50 and 80% return over time. That was in Brisbane. But you know, who knows what that actual settlement pattern may be and what people will choose to do, and will they choose to move next to a public transport node because it's convenient for them to get in and out of the city, or is that no longer required? Will they choose, particularly from an affordable housing perspective, where people have maybe lost jobs or are losing income, will they choose for more affordability to move somewhere out of the city or further away where they don't need to be travelling in and out all the time? So some of those choices I think are really important for people. There is that trade-off as well of private vehicles. I do agree with Rod. The thing that at the moment the roads are empty, so private vehicles can travel around quite freely. When congestion starts hitting again, I think we'll start to see people thinking about the choices that they make and not wanting to be stuck in that congestion at the moment. So I think there's a lot of things to come through the pipeline for this.
Thanks, Emma. Yes, I heard from one transport secretary last week that whilst the roads are empty, apparently there's a little tick up in the accident rate because people are driving faster because of the lack of congestion.
And the other thing I saw recently. Oh, yeah, sorry, Rod.
One of the really sad things, Simon, the road accident fatality rate has not declined at all. And we are getting more speeding fines because I think the freer flowing roads are actually upping the average speed.
Yeah. Just we move to the next question. I would like to encourage the participants to begin to log their Q&A online. There's a couple of buttons down the bottom of the screen, and Margie is eagerly awaiting the receipt of your questions. There's currently 62 of you, so we ought to be able to get a few decent questions out of the group. I think one of the fascinating questions for mine is what does this all mean for demand profiles looking forward? If we try and get beyond the immediacy of the crisis and the return to work, and maybe if you're optimistic, we do have a vaccine in 12 or 18 months. But what are the lasting impacts on demand for the system, both road network and rail and bus and ferry networks? Who would like to pick that one up?
I will.
Yeah, go Leah.
Leah, then Rod.
I'll give me, Leah can go, then I'll give me some time to have a crack with Simon.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of the demand, it's really hard to tell. So, you know, we're doing surveys and focus groups, but right now people are focused on the here and now. So we're really confident that it will recover, and it's just a matter of, you know, what that model looks like and what that time frame looks like. But I think that sort of moves me to, you know, Rod mentioned earlier the peaks in New South Wales, and it's consistent in New South Wales and in Victoria. So it's a sea of high vis first thing in the morning, and that's a good thing. It you know, our business is of course public transport, but it's also the projects that sit alongside of that. And so it's been really important for us, and I think for our industry, to keep that project work underway. And I think the challenge for all of us here is, you know, with the stimulus spending, to not only keep delivering current projects and shovel-ready projects, but also to think about sort of the doing all of the planning and design and keeping that white-collar skill set engaged and in work. So, you know, the concern, I suppose, that we see looking forward is just, you know, engineers and other sort of specialist skill sets, perhaps not having quite the level of work and engagement, depending on where funding is coming from and what other stimulus is being spent on.
So, Simon, I think we're confident that over time the demand levels will come back pretty strongly. The question for us, and it's not so much whether government has policy around this, but the way sort of industry and business behaves, particularly in our public transport system. You know, one of the biggest demand drivers is CBD employment, without a doubt, and it drives the peakiness and it drives a lot of the pressure on the system. If you're sort of an optimist at one level, and I'll sort of say that generally because it does have sort of varied impacts. A significant shift to a different way of working, people travelling at different times, maybe only going to the office certain days of the week at a much larger scale than we ever thought about, completely shifts not necessarily the volume, but the time of day travel and so forth. So we've been talking about flattening the curve for the last 3 months in terms of the disease. I'd like to be optimistic that we might be able to flatten the curve of demand, which might create a massive opportunity for us to reposition our service offer. So rather than this really high intense resource morning and afternoon, a more even resource spread out all the day type of public transport service that runs, that gives people more option at the time of day that suits them. So I don't think that will happen overnight, but I think with the shift in people's thinking on what they can do and how they can work, we see a sort of a really positive opportunity. How much we nudge that through pricing and so forth, discussions to be had. How much it requires a broader policy shift across government, discussion to be had. Industry's got to see a productivity gain in it. Business has got to see a productivity gain in it. I think it's there. I think if you think back how many hours you and I and all of us spend travelling every month for work, and if you could take a quarter of that out and allocate that towards more productive time and a bit more well-being, you know, there's a big shift in society to come from that, but business has got to want to embrace that as well.
And what role do we think transport, and particularly public transport, has to play in the economic stimulus and recovery that is to come? There's been a lot of discussion about, you know, how easy or hard it is to accelerate major projects, whether maintenance expenditure, excuse me, can pick up some of the slack that's arising in other, you know, construction sectors that are slowing. What does the group think the potential is, and where specifically might some of that stimulus money be going?
Perhaps I could start with that. I think everyone's been doing a pretty good job in the construction industry to keep construction going, and Leah and Rod's remarks about having public transport systems full of fluoro workers, I think, is testimony to that. So it's great that those pipelines haven't really been impacted as much, but I think that there's probably a couple of things that we've learned from stimulus projects in the past through GFC and other things, that it's still important to do the projects that matter the most. So making sure that they're economically viable, even if we bring them into smaller projects, which I think is, you know, there's been a lot of commentary on, and there's a lot of smaller projects to do that can employ smaller companies. Then we can assess those in groups and get them moving quickly. There's also an opportunity, I think, for Australia to take a step change in the way that we have different industries, particularly around some of the things like charging infrastructure for electric vehicles or hydrogen plants or whatever that's going to be that takes our future look of transport. Now's the time to look at what projects can really influence that and get us moving more quickly.
One last question to the panel, and then I'll give Margie a heads up that I'm passing back to her so she can get her puppy out of the screen view. Leah, you mentioned patronage risk, and you know, there aren't that many contracts in Australia that have a lot of revenue risk, but some do. And I guess this situation must be testing the various force majeure clauses that exist in a lot of, you know, both operational and construction contracts. Rod, what's your observation about what this event might do to both, you know, the ability to transfer any form of revenue risk and also people's focus and energy next time they pick up a contract to look at a force majeure clause?
Yeah, so I think in the operating contract space, Simon, we have been fortunate, whether by design or luck, that in New South Wales, most of our contracts are more service performance based rather than revenue. And that has really allowed us to continue to run the services and to keep operators viable. And our big commitment was keep the services going, lots of space on public transport. And we knew that that was keeping the operators moving. Whether we'd have been able to sustain that if it had gone for many, many months, Simon, I don't know. But because it's come and gone pretty quickly, it's worked well. There's a little bit of revenue risk in regional buses. That's probably the only area, but we were able to sort of deal with that working pretty closely with the operators. So I think it is challenging. I do feel for the other jurisdictions where there's more of a revenue risk, and they've obviously had to work pretty closely with operators. But it's given me a freedom to move really quickly, you know, in the interest of customer and community. So it's probably going to be a bit challenging, I would have thought, to bring in hard revenue risk in the short term. In terms of construction, you know, one of the takes, we had some good industry engagement directly. One of the great strengths of construction is that it actually has a safe system set up on its sites already. So COVID was really an overlay with that. Certainly there's some supply chain type things, but our view was, you know, lawyers can come in and hit really hard on force majeure. Well, it didn't really eventuate, notwithstanding there was a lot in there. I think we just need to be very nuanced. If there was a genuine impact somewhere, then we've always said to the industry, we will have a chat with you and we'll understand that and we'll support you. But we're not going to be up for these sort of blanket processes and so forth to sort of change the game in industry as a result of COVID-19. There's other industry shifts that are probably more significant around availability of workforce and skills and so forth that we need to be focusing on collectively.
Terrific, thank you. Look, in the interest of time, I'm going to leave it there and I'll pass back to Margie. I can see we've got quite a number of Q&A questions come in from our participants, but thank you all. Over to you, Margie.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you everybody for those comments. Now let's dive into some of this stuff that's happening out there from our participants today. And I might shoot this one at Leah in the first instance. How hard do you think it's going to be to rebuild the trust of the community in the public transport system? You know, what do you see as the key factors in that? And I know you've all sort of variously touched on aspects of it, but what do you think the most telling factor will be there in terms of rebuilding that public trust?
Yeah, well, I think public trust in public transport is actually aligned to trust generally around the health of the community, and then all of the information and the cleaning and other things that we do to instill trust. And I think there's also a bit of a behaviour when people see others catching public transport, they're more likely to then get on board and try that. So I think it's us restoring confidence by providing more information. You know, there's going to be a bit of PR around this, so it's going to be also demonstrating what we're doing around cleaning, be it frequency, systems, products, technology, all of those things that give people great confidence in what we're doing. And I think in the early stages too, it's about the experience that they have when they travel on our public transport, irrespective of mode. So I think early on, you know, people are going to be nervous about physical distancing, some of those things, and I'm sure that will reduce over time.
Thank you. Rod, from your point of view, I can only imagine this is a big piece on the horizon, because we are seeing all these lovely people getting back into their cars. I mean, I think, you know, we touched on the fact that our research is showing us that people feel better about trains than they do about planes, and better about planes than they do about buses. But the thing they most prefer at the moment is getting back in their own car. So what are we going to do about that, getting them back out of their cars and the congestion issue?
Well, I think we're playing the long game on this, Margie, and it's actually about making sure that whatever the sentiment is about public transport today, that it gets better in the weeks and months ahead. So that's about probably being a bit conservative, but the cleaning regimes that we've all talked around on this, managing the capacity on the network and giving the information to customers so they make the best choices. I think over time, if anything, we might find people that have jumped out of public transport in the car might find the experience not that great. We've got really busy roads and so forth. So if the confidence actually is held and grows on what we're doing in transport, I'm actually really confident in a city like Sydney that the shift will come back over time. I just wanted to come back across the whole day rather than in a morning and afternoon tea.
And yeah, look, I mean, that's going to be a really important part of this process, isn't it? How government actually engages with the private sector on redesigning their workplaces and their work styles. In other words, you know, how they structure a day. I mean, how well prepared do you think the corporate sector is for that, Rod? Be honest.
I don't know. In fact, it's a conversation that we really want to get into. I don't think it has to be solved tomorrow, but I think over the next few months, that's the thing we should really talk about. And there are potential winners and losers this, but there could be a lot of wins. And I don't mean just for transport. So yeah, I'm focused on wanting to flatten the curve, as I said a bit earlier. But imagine the lifestyle benefits of people being able to live locally more, spend more of their time locally, and what that will do for local communities, local industries, local economies, more active transport in and around local areas, and all of some of the societal benefits that will come from that. Maybe it creates more space for renewal of the CBDs to be a little bit more dynamic and not so much office space, but actually more broader sort of 7-day-a-week thing, maybe a little bit more living, maybe more tourism activity, more capacity for tourism facilities and so forth. Maybe pitching right at you there. So I just think there's some opportunities to reshape the economy in a way. If business see the productivity benefit of it and people start working differently, there's some really, really positive opportunities that come, and transport can be one of the parts of that, but it's not the only thing. I'd love nothing more than to think some of our longer term capital programs could be reprioritised, because suddenly the demand levels are different and we can put our money into newer sort of developing areas such as Western Sydney rather than sort of heavily congested areas.
Thank you. And Emma, from your point of view, given your portfolio within PwC, this must be a very fascinating time to look at that crossover between public transport and urban design. And what do you think the big outcomes from an urban renewal and the way we use and design cities are going to be out of this process of changed transport requirements, changed working days, that whole mechanism?
There's so many forces of change at the moment, Margie. I think we'd seen a retail sector that was under stress before this happened, and it'll be, you know, interesting to see how retail comes back and what we do with our face-to-face shopping time. I saw some discussion about whether suburban shopping centres would be repurposed into office space so that people could have that more localised office sort of environment and stay closer to home. So there's a whole bunch of forces that are changing the way that people are choosing to do things. I think the other part of this is the mental health concerns that will come out of not just the last few months. So we've been talking about mental health a lot better in recent times, but the forces of anxiety that people might have in being close together and working close together are offset against those concerns about isolation and being alone. And so I think that's another area that we probably need to understand a lot better about as human beings. What are we feeling that we need, and how do we manage that in our urbanisation?
And that's the important bit too, isn't it? Putting that human face on it. You know, this is a terrible situation, but one should never waste a crisis. There has to be some good news and some legacies that come out of this. Just sort of moving on to another people aspect of this, and understanding that there's going to be a whole range of infrastructure projects around the country but also simply the need to manage the transport system and the available skills to do that. Clearly, the next little while is going to make it quite difficult to, if we haven't got the skills already, to bring people in to do this kind of work, whether it be the arcane work of being a signaller on the rail service or whatever else it might be. Rod, is this something that you and your team are giving a bit of thought to at the moment, what we do about that skills shortage piece?
Oh, before COVID-19, Margie, we had a pretty significant piece of work going under the banner of Future of Work, and what we think we need to be as a workforce going forward, and obviously with all the technology coming through. So it's pretty on our horizon. There are definitely some skill challenges in and around that, but I think a lot of industries are facing that disruption at the moment, and it'll be a combination of new entrants coming in, particularly the sort of the younger people coming through into the job market, but being more deliberate about reskilling, repurposing the people that we've got, acknowledging the value and the knowledge of the business that they have, but also acknowledging that their skill is not the one that we need anymore, but maybe we can use their knowledge, reskill them and push them forward. So trying to recycle that a little bit more, probably a poor term to use, but actually thinking about how we can sort of move our people with that. Half of them will retire in our workforce over the next 10 years. So that's a big challenge, but the other half, a lot of those are going to need to reskill, so focus on that.
Thank you. And Leah, from your perspective too, and I'd be interested also in just a little perspective what you might be able to bring to this as an international company, the sorts of things you might be hearing from overseas in terms of how people are managing this system, as well as the skills question.
Yeah, well, you know, Rod's really spoken to skills, and that's been on the agenda, I think, for all of us and for construction, but particularly rail specialist skills. That's been something that, you know, we've been talking about for a long time. And I think with this work continuing, it's going to be continuing to be something we need to think about. You know, the thought that goes into where we focus the repurposing of skills, I think is important, but, you know, not to repeat what Rod's been talking about. But you know, I sort of reiterate the point about, you know, us having shortages in some areas and just being mindful of other areas where we've got skills that I think are really important to retain, and making sure that we're continuing to sort of design and develop the pipeline.
Okay, so I'm curious too, Emma, from your perspective, because I'm sure you're keeping a sharp eye on jurisdictions all around the world in terms of how they're managing this process. I mean, I think Australia's done very well in terms of management of the disease. How are we stacking up in terms of the way we're managing things like the re-entry to work and the public transport system?
Well, across the world, I think it just really depends on the population and what people, you know, how countries are reacting and responding to things. It's interesting to see in America, where they've opened up regions, that people are still choosing to take a very cautious approach as individuals and not re-engage in the community. So restaurants and businesses where they've reopened cities completely are still not showing any real growth because people haven't decided that it's safe yet. Whereas I was talking to someone in a public transport system this week who said they're struggling to keep people off their public transport system, and their perception of that is that people have decided in their city it's safe. And so I think that goes back to Rod's earlier point that when people more generally, and Leah, when we more generally feel a sense of security, we will go back to being closer together and trusting each other as human beings that we can be close together. But until that time, I think that, you know, people are taking a very cautious approach, and rightly so.
Well, thank you. I'm conscious of our time, but I am going to ask one last question of Rod, because I know that when Metro first started, he was very committed to getting out there on the trains, talking to the people on the trains and understanding how it was working and what was going on. So, Rod, is there a similar regime this time round? Are you going to be out on a whole lot of different forms of transport, talking to the customers and your staff and just seeing how things are going?
Yeah, in fact, Margie, one of the things that I've sort of missed out on in the last couple of months is that genuine work from home. I'm actually at home right now, and I have been at home a lot, but not necessarily for whole days, because you know, I've got more than 12,000 frontline staff of my own, plus our operators that we're contracted to. So I've been out and about on the network a lot, just keeping in touch with staff. and just interesting to see how they've sort of shifted through, and their commitment to being out there is extraordinary. But their anxiety is also understandably high. And so just being out there and actually being in touch and moving around on the system has been very rewarding for me personally as a leader, but very insightful in terms of how things are starting to move.
Well, and can I say, any of you who are on the public transport system in the near future and see Rod, go up and tell him what a great job he's doing.
I always get the full range of feedback, Margie, I have to say, when I get out.
I bet you do. Well, I'm going to encourage all the most positive kind of it.
Thank you.
Can I finish by thanking you all very much, Simon, for a fabulous piece of moderating and for all of your ongoing support of TTF. And I should mention to people we're going to have some quite exciting transport work coming out soon under the auspices of the transport panel, which Simon chairs. So watch this space. And if I can thank Emma, Leah and Rod for giving us their time today and being so frank about what's happening in the system. Thank you all very much and stay safe.
Thanks, Maggie.
Thanks, Maggie.
Thank you all.